Okay, so we've been discussing different types of contracts, and we began last week to discuss the status of what's known as ksav. A ksav is an autograph, I guess you would say, or it's the um, self-generated contract. Instead of what we've been dealing with until now, Gittin and Shtaros, which is a text which is either signed by two witnesses or which is presented to the recipient, the beneficiary, in the presence of two witnesses. Instead of that, we're talking about a circumstance where the mischayev, the person who is committing, and is conceding, in this particular transaction. So he, writes the text himself, or there's a text that he signs himself. That's called kosav biksav yado. And the question is, what is the status of a ksav yad, of an autograph, if you will? How does that, rank relative to a contract which is signed by witness? So basically, this issue comes up in a number of contexts. We began with this last week, but we didn't get to some of the issues. So let me go back a little bit. So if you look at the Mishnah on Pei Vav Amud Aleph, those who have a Gemara in front of them, and if not, you can look on page probably 5, maybe 6, either 5 or 6, depending on
what daf is it again?
Pei Vav Amud Aleph 86 A.
Pei Vav. Oh.
Pei Vav.
Okay.
So the Gemara, the Mishnah on Pei Vav Amud Aleph, this is what we started with last week, but we need to finish this part of it. Says that Gimel Gittin Psulim. It's also on Daf Gimel Amud Beis, and as we'll see, it's quoted in other Gemaras as well. So the Mishnah says Shlosha Gittin Psulim. There are 3 contracts or Gittin which are rabbinically inferior, and they should be disqualified. I mean, you shouldn't use them. However, if you go ahead and you do use them, the child that might be produced as a result of relying on such a get will not be a mamzer, meaning the divorce is a proper divorce, even though we prefer you not use this, qualitatively deficient get. Now, what's qualitatively deficient about this get, or these 3 cases of get? So the Mishnah explains, Kasa b'ksav yado ve'ein olavedim, yesh olavedim ve'ein bozman, yesh bozman ve'ein bo ela eid echad, hare'elu shlosha gittin psulim, v'imnisei savlad kasher. The Mishnah repeats. So the 3 cases are, you wrote the text yourself, or you signed the text yourself without witnesses, meaning you wrote, I hereby divorce, X hereby divorces Y, or I hereby divorce my wife Y. You write the proper text and so on. But instead of either presenting this in the presence of Adim or having Adim sign on, all there is your own signature or your own handwriting, as the case may be, nothing else. So the question is that a valid get or not? So the Mishnah says, with regard to Gittin, it is valid enough that b'di'eved, even though we prefer you not use it, but if you do go ahead and use it, the divorce is finalized, and therefore any subsequent relationship is not considered a betrayal of the marriage, and any child that emerges from a subsequent relationship would not be a mamzer. In other words, kasa biksav yado, if he writes it in his own hand, meaning it's an autograph, ve'ein olavedim, even though there are no witnesses of any sort, is pasul midrabanan, but kosher min Torah, and that's what we need to know. The other 2 cases are yesh olavedim ve'ein bozman, and yesh bozman ve'ein bo eled echad. So what that is the you have witnesses, you have the proper text, But what's missing is Zman. You didn't write the time. Welcome, Rabbi Roth. I see Rabbi Roth in the screen here. But if you don't have Zman, you don't have the timing in the get, but you have everything else, that's also, preferably, not to be used. But b'diavad, if you go ahead, you use it, it's a proper get, and the children are kosher. And the third one is kasav biksav yado v'yesh olav eid echad. There's a combination of an eid echad. I'm sorry, the third one is the case of yesh bo zman ve'ein bo el eid echad. You have zman in the get. You have eid echad, not the ksav of the individual, probably the ksav of the sofer. So you have two witnesses if you combine the signature of one witness and the handwriting or the testament of the sofer. So these are the three cases. I'm only interested right now in the first case, Kasav biksav yado ve'ein olav eidim. He writes, I'll just give you one more second. He writes it in his own hand, meaning it's an autograph, but there are no witnesses. What we're being told here is that even though we prefer you don't do this, b'diavad, it is a proper get. Now, the question I want to discuss is, what about, is it a shtar, is it a contract, or is it just an exception that it works in Gittin? For example, does it work in Kiddushin? A shtar works in Kiddushin. We know that. One of the three methods of getting married is with a contract, a shtar. It's actually derived from Gittin, v'yatza v'haisa. So can you use a ksav yad of the Baal without Eidim? Can you use that for Kiddushin as well? We'll see in a moment that that's very controversial. Or let's say you have a loan contract. Again, instead of witnesses, you have the handwriting of the lova. I mean, the debtor hands the creditor a document in his own handwriting saying, I hereby, acknowledge that I borrowed $100 from you, and the amount is due at such and such date, etc. What is the status of a ksav yad in Dinei Mamonos? So that's what I want to examine. It definitely works in Gittin Min HaTorah. Does it work in Kiddushin at all? And does it work in Dinei Mamonos? Yes or no? That's what we're going to discuss. Yes, you had a question.
Oh, yes. When you talk about timing, Rabbi, do you mean clock timing and date and day?
I definitely mean the date, and we definitely mean the day. The question whether you also need to integrate the timing is a little bit of more of a complicated question. It seems like in different regions there were different practices regarding that. So, for example, we spoke, about 2 or 3 weeks ago about the Gemara in Masechet Ksuvos, Daf Tzadi Dalid, which speaks about Shnei Shtaros Hayotzim Biyom Echad, like a person wrote a contract to give away his field as a gift, but he gave the whole field away to 2 different people on the same day. And the problem was that Ein Kosvin Shos, in that place, the practice was not to write down the time. They used to write the date, but not the time. So that was the problem. The problem was that, we can't tell from the document itself who was given, precedence or who really was given the field. And therefore, that was why the Gemara records a debate. What do you do in such a case? Do you have to split it, yachloku, or do you say what we call shuda dedaini, which is you try to figure out, who the likely intended recipient was. But that's because Ein Kosvin Sha'os, in that place, they didn't write, the time. So, but we're talking about
is this
the date. That's probably what most.
Is this business of Ein Kosvin Sha'os?
Yeah.
Is it just a minhag, or is it a halacha?
No.
How did the whole thing develop?
Right. I think, they, no, I think it's just what was done in certain, places. There's nothing wrong if you want to be more specific and you want to explicate the time rather, that can be very helpful. But when the Gemara says you need dates and a get, it typically doesn't mean the hour, it means the day. Again, and the reason for it is the Gemara. This is the Gemara earlier in Daf Yud Zayin in Gittin. The Gemara has two different views. One is Mishum Peri, because there are economic implications for when the get actually, what date the get takes place, because again, the economic relationship between husband and wife changes once there's a divorce, in terms of nechse milug, and in terms maybe of other things like nechasim mishubadim, all sorts of things. So that's one explanation. And the other discussion in the Gemara is shema yichap al basa choso, which means if the woman was unfaithful in the marriage, but let's say she's a relative of her husband, not just because he married her, let's say it was his niece. So on the one hand, he's upset with her because she betrayed the marriage. On the other hand, he doesn't want any ill, consequence
within the family. Yeah.
So then in the family. So they were worried that it would be a cover-up. So the one view in the Gemara was that's the reason why we insist on midrabanan, on having zman beget. But in the end of the day, that's what we mean when we say yesh alavedim ve'bo zman. Yeah.
But, Rabbi, shouldn't the time be very important in the case of illicit relationship in terms of timing, and that the wife is pregnant as a result? So obviously,
yeah, but not the time of the day, but the date for sure.
But why not what?
I mean, it could be. It could be. I think they're just, they just didn't necessarily, didn't always. You have to understand these documents were often prepared in advance. So when you prepare a document in advance, it can be difficult enough in some cases, to predict, the date, or to establish the date, to establish the time. I mean, for example, we have weddings, right? They're called for a certain time, depending on, how meticulous people are about, how precise they are, how careful they are about the timing. There can be, several hours, gap. So you don't have to go back and rewrite the whole thing. So often, I think the practice was just to stick with the day itself for most purposes, not all purposes. That's why I gave the example, Shnei Shtoros HaYotzim B'Yom Echad. But for most purposes, that will solve most of the problem.
Gemara also tells us many times that certain parts of the day, we had that by Erev Pesach, people don't really know. They didn't have watches in those days. So there was also a lack of accuracy in the time anyway.
Yeah, that's true. That's true. And this was a morning or evening.
In the morning and late at night and midday.
Right. When it comes to Drisha v'Chakira, for example, the Gemara says in Sanhedrin, so, when in Sanhedrin, the Gemara says that, one of the 7 questions to ask, is, when did it happen? And if there's a discrepancy between the hours, exactly what you said, sometimes we allow for like certain flexibility because, people weren't wearing watches. And as you say, it was based on like it was dark, it was light, it was, the beginning of the afternoon, it was the end of the afternoon. So it's not endless, like there's a certain, a certain par. If the discrepancy is too great, that's going to be.
Rabbi, if his wife, still not yet divorced, was seen entering alone with another man prior to the time it was signed,
right?
Let's face the day, so morning, afternoon, and that the get was only signed in the afternoon, but 2 Adim saw the wife and
that would be a problem.
A third party, then they can say, well, the date is okay, it's kosher, but the time is not, because
right. I think it's just no, I think you're right. I mean, it can only be beneficial, but I'm trying to explain why, obviously if everything, is accurate and everything can be, established, with that level of knowledge, and control about when everything is going to take place, then that would be beneficial for sure. But I think there's a certain latitude or leeway, just by virtue of the fact that, like, you set a date, you set a time for the get to take place. This one's subway is late. This one decides they're not coming at the last minute until you convince them to show up. If you have to redo the text all over again, remember that we're talking about a get also, meaning where there's a requirement of lishma, or it has to be written in a precise way. So if you're, weighing the law, like would I prefer to have precision of the not only the date but the time, or the flexibility, so that documents will still be effective even if they're not completely accurate to the minute. It's something to weigh. It's understandable that they're going to be that there's going to be a trade-off in those two things. But you're quite right. There can be cases, just like we were saying, right? If it's said in the shtar, at 1 p.m. I'm giving my property to Ruvain, and then the other one it said at at 7 p.m. I'm giving it to Shimon, right? We wouldn't have a problem. But the downside is that when you prepare documents and people, either come late or they get cold feet or they're just, it's a Sephardic wedding, it's an Ashkenazi wedding.
About erasures in a get?
What?
What is the halacha regarding erasures in the get?
Erasures? No, you have to be very careful about. We'll discuss that. But
no, because that may be a reason why not to put the time in. Because if you put the time in and then it doesn't come out to be exactly that.
That's what I was saying a minute ago. Right.
We have to
That's what I mean about the flexibility. No, 100%. I mean, there's something called, whether you can write on a machak, you need a ksav sheyachal lihizdayef. There are all sorts of law. It may depend if you're dealing with Eidei Masira or Eidei Chasima. It's very complicated. We probably will.
It's messy to have to change something on the shtar. Not a pun. I mean,
right. Or if it's inaccurate and you can't change it, so then you're back to square one, and then you've delayed the whole process.
In those days, an expensive process. You had to do it on parchment. You had to get a sulfur.
Yeah. Right, not so simple. In some cases, they also, as I say, people like today. Sometimes there's a shasa kosher for these things. Like people are reluctant, and you want to finish this off so that nobody will extort and so on. So there's like a window of opportunity. And if you there could be all sorts of issues. So it's your point is well taken, but as I say, it's a trade-off in terms of the legal benefits and the drawbacks, and you have to calculate that. So in some places they actually did not write shows. For example, when we do a ksuva, we don't write in the hour. Right?
I was just going to ask that why don't we insist on having the time in the ksuba?
Why? Why would you need it in ksuba?
Because every ksuba would have to be rewritten.
Right, for the reasons I was just discussing.
You ever gone to a wedding?
The more specific you are, the more, the easier it is to run into difficulties. When the real world kind of
interferes with the abstract planning. But the reality is that
the date on the kasuba gets hairy, and when the wedding actually takes place. Imagine
especially when there's a Ben Hashmashos wedding or something like that. So it's all difficult, but it's all challenging. Even the way it is. But in a regular ksuba, we don't write the hour; we write the day.
Of course.
B'shlishi b'Shabbos, b'Revi b'Shabbos, etc. So it's if you did write the time, that it wouldn't disqualify it, but it's you're limiting, the potential, or you're expanding the potential for trouble. So you just have to weigh those two things. Anyways, getting back, that's actually not our topic. Our topic
that's true.
Kosa b'Ksavyado. So getting back to Kosa b'Ksavyado, everybody's any other questions for the moment, or we're good?
Yes, okay. Well, it seems on the three questions you pose, the application of the test of if it is ever contradicted or requested to be invalid, that's when it's important. Each case can be delineated separately. In other words, in all three cases, if nobody comes forward and disputes the validity of the document, there's no issue. The test that has to apply is somebody says, I never wrote it, I never had anything to do with it, must be examined as the principle in each one of the cases. For example, in Kedushin. If somebody said, I didn't write it, I didn't intend it, but he has edus for biu or edut kesef, then it should be determined as valid, the ketubah. If in the case of Maimonides, if the shtar, he says, I never owed Mr. Smith $100, but Mr. Smith swears that it's true that he owes him, and they can show.
We'll get to all that. We'll get to that. But these three cases are not issues of dispute. Just let me make it clear. The three examples of the Mishnah, which are psulim, but havlad enam mamzer, because they're kosher b'diavad, are even if there's no dispute. In other words, we prefer to have documents that are more accurate, that are more refined. So if you have a document without any date, we prefer that you not use that for a get. But if you use it, it'll be fine. That's separate from any kind of dispute. We will discuss. Your question is an important question. It's just not in this Mishnah, meaning that's what's called orin. If there are challenges, like to the authenticity of either a contract or any other interaction between the parties, then there are other rules that take over. And we're going to discuss that actually in Dinei Mamonos in just a minute. But these three gittin that we're talking about in this Mishnah, meaning kasab eksavyado ve'ein olavedim, yesh olavedim ve'ein bozman, yesh bozman ve'ein bo ela eid echad, these are all cases where we prefer to have higher standards, but, if it's already done, we're going to accept it. That has nothing to do, even if there are no disputes. It's even absent dispute, we prefer higher standards.
Not really.
And even if there is dispute, we will say that it's kosher.
Not really accepting that. You're only accepting the fact that the children from such a marriage are not.
Well, then that implicitly we're saying that she's divorced.
But we would ask them to redo it.
Yeah, we prefer that. But in terms of the Doraisa, Minatorah.
Would a Mesader Kedushin agreed to marry this woman, knowing in advance of that marriage that this is one of those three cases?
Probably not. He would say, I prefer to get a better get.
No, but is he obligated? In other words, it's one thing to say, okay, it happened already. That's what the evidence is, basically. It happened already. So, okay, the children are not mamzer. But now this person is supposed to be authenticating the marriage, even though he really has no real role in it, so to speak. But still, if he agrees to go ahead, knowing that there is some potential question.
Mesader Kedushin, if he was faced with this situation, would say, you should get a get, which is, on a higher standard, if that's what you're asking.
Sure.
But what I'm interested in here more is, that's a rabbinic requirement. Minatorah, that's a proper get. Meaning the Vlad being not a mamzer proves that Minatorah is a proper get. Okay, so I want to zero in on kasab eksavyado, the text without any kind of edus, and try to examine what the status of that is. So in Dinei Mamonos, this becomes very interesting. In Kosher Mishpat, in civil law, what is the status of kasab eksavyado? So let me make
star. You mean
what?
By a regular star.
Yeah. So let me explain. Let's take the case of a milva, because that's the easiest case and that's the most frequent one. A milva is a loan. So let me make it clear. When you have a milva b'shtar, meaning a loan that is, documented in a contract, there are two types of loans, right? Well, there may be three. So one is a loan which is documented by a contract. That's called a milva b'shtar. The other is called milva al peh. Milva al peh means just, there's an oral, I lent you money. You admit it, that at least we agree that.
No witnesses.
But there are no witnesses. Okay, but there's an agreement, or there is witnesses. Sorry, I shouldn't say that. There is witnesses. There's just no contract. It's called a milva al peh.
But if there's witnesses, it's equivalent, basically, almost to a
No. So that's what we're going to point out. Let's say you have a malva lechavero bifnei edim in the presence of two witnesses, but it wasn't, no contract was produced. So there are two differences. I'll explain. Let me just get this out of the way, so then you'll see what's really going on. And this goes to the heart of what we're dealing with. There are two differences between what's called a milva al peh and a milva bishtar. A milva al peh, meaning even if there are witnesses, right? But there is no contract. So there are two issues. One is there's no what's called gevia minachasa mishubadim, meaning when it's time for me to repay the loan, if I don't have available assets, right? Let's say I sold off some of my landed property, right? And the point is that in the milva al peh, there's no what's called nechasa mishubad.
So there's no call.
The Gemara says because no call, but either way, whatever the reason is, I mean, some Gemaras say there's no call. I don't want to get into the exact point right now, but whatever it is, there's no geviyim and nechasa mishubadim. In other words, when the time comes to pay, you can only collect from the assets that are available in the possession of the debtor, not from any assets that he earlier, subsequent to the obligation, but before the geviyah, before the collection, sold off and are, there's no liened property when it's a mill. That's a huge difference in terms of, what you can collect from assets. The second difference, which is very, very important, is what we call shtarcha biyadi, my boy. Now, what that means is, it literally means shtarcha biyadi, if you're, if the contract or your contract is in my hands, my boy, then like what's doing or what do you want from me? Okay, what that means is as follows. Let's say the following happens. Ruvain lends $100 to Shimon, right? And in front of witnesses, so he can't deny it. And if the amount is, let's say the amount is due after 30 days.
He says he paid it back.
Wait. Let's assume we're going to take the easy case. Last year, I'm just going to mention this tangentially. When we learned Bava Basra, we discussed the following problem. Let's say the person claims that he paid back within 30 days. So that's called, that's a suffix in the Gemara. The Gemara's not sure about that because most people don't pay back early.
Person doesn't do that.
People procrastinate or they keep the money as long as they can, but they typically don't pay early. I'm not saying no one does, but so that's the Gemara's discussion. So let's leave that out for the moment. Let's say the debt is due on day 30, and on day 31, I come to you and I say, it's time to pay up. So if you say to me, I paid you yesterday, right? After the due date, right? And you're not in front of witnesses. You don't need to pay me in front of witnesses. So that's called kofar. And I say, what are you talking about? You didn't pay me yesterday. I never received anything from you. That's called kofar hakol. Kofar hakol means I deny it completely. If I deny your claim completely and there are no witnesses, I am, exempt. That's my word against your word.
Yeah, but you should have a receipt.
However,
shouldn't there be a receipt? If someone pays someone, shouldn't they get a receipt?
So hold on one second. However, if it's a milva bishtar, if the loan was administered, with a contract, so then if I come back to you after 30 days and I say it's time to pay up, and you say I paid you yesterday, then I can say to you, where's your receipt? Or if you really paid me back, why don't you either have a receipt or why didn't you insist on tearing up the original contract? Why would you leave a smoking gun in my possession so that I could, come back and try to collect from you again?
Why can't we say the same thing on milva al peh? Well, if you borrowed the money in front of Adam, why didn't you pay it back in front of Adam?
So the Gemara says that amalva bifnei Adam ein tzarech lefaro be'edim. This is a Gemara in Masechet.
But the logic is still the same. In other words,
no. I mean, it's a different level. I mean, if you say to me, is it illogical to say that amalva lifnei Adam tzarech lefaro be'edim? It's not illogical. but it's also not as
But in
compelling.
other words, you're saying to them, how is it possible that you were so foolish that you didn't take back the star? So now the same question, how can you be so foolish? You borrowed the money in front of Adam, okay? So I have proof that you borrowed the money. So if you paid me back, you should have done it in front of Adam also.
Right, but there are levels in all these things. So leaving a smoking gun in my hand is worse than not bringing, proof, that you repaid. So basically, there are two. Let me make it clear once again. There are two differences between what's called a milva al peh and a milva bishtar. It's like very important topics in contract law and halacha, civil law. So milva al peh, there's no geviyim menachasim mishubadim. Number one, you can only collect available assets, not shibudim. That's number one. And number two is there's no equivalent, since we paskin a malva bifnei edim ein tzarich l'faro be'edim, even if the loan took place in front of witnesses, the repayment does not have to take place. Remember, it's also cumbersome and tedious. I want to get my money back, and there are no witnesses around, right? So you don't always want to wait to get your money back, right? So, but if there's a smoking gun, and I don't either get a receipt or a ripped up or rip up the, or neutralize the smoking gun, that's a bigger problem, is what I'm saying, in the range of issues and problems. So those are the two differences between a milva al peh bifnei edim and a milva bishtar. So the question is, this is what we're going to get to in a second, what about a ksav yad?
Isn't that a doris baldin?
Well, we'll see. Maybe yes, maybe no. We'll see in a moment. That some Rishonim are going to say it's doris baldin, but even then, the question is, what is the status of a ksav yad with regard to the two issues? Ksav yad means, again, I, in my own writing, in my own hand, write a document or a contract saying, the lova, let's say in this case, the lova writes, I am borrowing money from the creditor, and I'm obligated to repay him after a month. Okay, so there aren't witnesses, not Eidei Masira and not Eidei Chasima. There's only my written, a confession, whatever you want to call it. Does that have the status of milva al peh? Is that like witnesses only? It's not worse than witnesses, for sure. Is it like witnesses, or is it like a contract? So the Mishnah...
It should be like a contract, because we have Rish Lakish's comment that, contract has a certain level of
so that's what we want to figure out. But on the other hand, you said it was kind of like Hodos Baldin, right?
So it's the strongest to Adam, yes. It's Hodos Baldin, but we just pointed out beforehand that unfortunately for the poor guy who did this, that's not as good as a contract.
But on the other hand, it's a smoking gun that you're leaving in his hands. Right?
Well, 2 Adam is a smoking gun also to some degree.
No. Smoke 2 Adam are there.
It's a pistol. It's not a...
but they're gone. This remains. The Adam are present at the time of the halva.
You want to say that it's really like a star.
That's what we want. No, I'm not saying anything yet. I'm raising the question. I'm going to show you the different views. So what is and let's look at the evidence. And then we'll go back to Kiddushin and Gittin. I want to take a little bit of... just to show you, this is a very interesting big
So it's like a signed star, because it's like 2 witnesses, because his signature is equivalent.
So now you're saying it's like a star. Before you were saying it was like al peh.
I realize now that...
No, I'm not being critical. Well, the answer is you can't, on the one hand, you can't go right and you can't go wrong. It's a massive debate. Okay, so what is the evidence? So if you look on page 7 in our Mar Makomos, or if somebody has a Gemara in Bava Basra, the Mishnah, there's a Mishnah in Bava Basra, the beginning, half of it is a Mishnah in Bava Basra. The Mishnah in Bava Basra says, Hotzi olav ksav. Everybody have this on the Mar Makomos?
I have a Gemara. Which daf is it?
It's in Bava Basra.
On Bava Basra.
If you want to get Bava Basra,
I'll get it in a second.
That's a very big Masechta.
It's a big book.
Yeah.
And this is in the end of the book. Bava Basra is 176 pages. This is on page 175 of 176. So you have to persevere. You have to read the whole Bava Basra. We learned Bava Basra last year, but we didn't get this far. We started from the beginning. Keep going, and you get,
a very good
to
place.
the second last page. That's already an accomplishment. We tend to jump around a little bit.
I believe in Neise Sefer V'Nechze.
Okay, excellent. Great. So if anybody has Mar Makomos on them, I'm assuming everybody has the Mar Makomos.
So again, what daf is it, Rabbi?
The Mishnah is on Kuf Ayin Hey Amud Base.
The Mar Makomos are on the email, Rabbi Rosensweig. So everyone has it who received your email. They're right there.
Okay, terrific.
We can talk about it while we wait for the candidate to find the page.
That's okay. 176 B. Okay, you have that?
Almost there.
It's a good thing you don't have art scroll because there'll be like 4 different Bs.
Okay, all right. Please.
Are you ready? He's ready. Yeah. We can go forward.
176B. So the Mishnah says, Hotzi olav ksav yado shu chayev lo. Let's say the malveh, right, produces not the shtar, but a ksav yad, right? An autograph, we'll call it, right? That says that the loveh, right, the debtor owes him money. So the rule is goveh min chasim b'nei chorin. The creditor can use the ksav yad to collect, but only from available assets, not from any liened property. In other words, remember I said before, there were 2 differences between a milva al peh and a milva b'shtar. One different, or a milva be'edim and a milva b'shtar. One difference is nechasim mishabadim, whether it triggers a lien on the property, so that you could collect not only from the assets that are available right now to the debtor, but even property that, in the interim was sold to a buyer. That's not true in ksav yad. But what the Mishnah doesn't tell us is, what about the second halacha? What about shtarcha b'yadi my boy? Let's say the malveh pulls out a ksav yad, right? And the loveh says, I paid you yesterday. Will we believe him? Like we do in milval peh bifnei edim?
According to what we said before, no. we shouldn't believe him.
You should. Okay, so I'm going to show you in a minute that is a massive debate between Chachmei Ashkenaz Sfarad on one side and Chachmei Ashkenaz and Tzorfat on one side, Germany and France, and on the other side, the Gaonim and the Chachmei Sfarad, they argue, meaning the Rif, the Rambam, the Ramban, against Rashi, Rashbam, Tosfos, Tosas Rid, Rosh, etc. And I just wanted, this is one of the things I'm trying to investigate, because all this, let me explain my method here, so hopefully you'll see that it isn't madness. And that is, we're trying to figure out, a ksav yad certainly works minat Torah as a get. But we're trying to figure out, does that mean it's basically a shtar? It's basically a contract. We prefer one with witnesses, but, if this is what we have, minat Torah is good enough, it's a contract. Or even though it's not a contract, it works in get as kind of like a separate category. So I'm trying to trace the status of a ksav yad in Bine Mamanis and in Kiddushin in order to understand why it works in Gittin.
Didn't we answer the question already when we said that only b'di'evet are these 3 cases?
Midrabanan.
Yeah, but still, it's clearly shown.
I'm interested in the Daraisa category for the moment. Okay. Meaning, of course, but let me make it clear. And we're always, want to know what the halacha is.
No, but I'm saying we showed a difference in status clearly between a 2 full Adam on a document.
But we don't know whether that. But if that's not a Daraisa difference, then it could very well be that the ksav yad midoraisa, it's still. Why do I say midoraisa? Because again, we're not so much focused right now on what you're supposed to do. We're also interested in that, but I'm also interested conceptually to understand this category of ksav yad. Is it an inferior shtar, or it's not a shtar at all? It's some other entity, in which case it doesn't necessarily translate into kiddushin. And it doesn't necessarily translate into the world of civil law. Meaning there are shtaros in Gerushin, in Kiddushin, in Shichur Eved, and in civil law. And we know of a Ksav Yad min Torah being fully effective in a get. The evidence when it comes to Kiddushin, as we'll see, is unclear, although the positions that are staked out are very clear, but there's a debate. I'm going to show you that. And when it comes to Choshen Mishpat, civil law, it's also complicated. Because on the one hand, we already know one thing, it doesn't trigger Nechasim Mishubadim. But you said before, Nechasim Mishubadim is sometimes a function of kol. Like, by the way, what is kol? Kol is a kind of buyer beware.
The question on kol is the kol coming from the Edom or from the document? If it's coming from the document, it shouldn't be any difference. There's a document. If it's coming from the Edom, then it would be a problem.
Right. So let's assume there's no kol, but let's see what else there is. But a kol, by the way, means like there is pirsum, there is
word gets out,
publicity. And the purpose of the publicity when it comes to Nechasim Mishubadim is buyer beware.
Exactly.
Meaning, if it's not fair for a purchaser who bought property from the debtor, who never heard that he was in debt, and then all of a sudden he buys a piece of property and it turns out it was liened, to the repayment of this original debt. So if there's a call like, it's mefursam v'yadua, it's well known that this Ruvain, from whom you bought your field, has debts, and therefore it's very likely that the property that you owned, has a lien on it.
It's a risk you took knowingly.
So then, we're all taking our risks, and
probably
that's
got the property cheaper for that purpose.
Yeah, exactly. That's part of business, and that's calculation. But if he never finds out, if there's no way for him to know about it, so he hasn't calculated, he hasn't gotten the benefit of the cheaper price, as you say. So that's part of the problem of kol. There are other issues about shibudim, but let's assume for the moment that's part of it. So the first thing the Mishnah tells us is a ksav yad is not a shtar with respect to shibudim. But what we're not sure is that just a technicality because there's no kol? Or does it have something to do with the legal status of ksav yad being inadequate? Now, what about question number 2? Namely, so even before we get to question number 2, shtar kabyan my boy, let's take a look now at the Gemara. And if you have the Mar Makomos, this is on page, I think, 8 probably, or the bottom of 7. The Gemara in Kuf Ayin Vav Amud Aleph in Bava Basra. For the Chazan, who believes in the, in the quality of Naisi Sefer V'Nechazi, you just have to turn. You're on the last page of Bava. You're about to make a siyum practically on Bava Basra.
Right.
So listen to this. This is a very fascinating discussion. The Gemara says, well, not so fast. What do you mean the Mishnah says there's no nechasim mishubadim in a ksav yad? What about the following case? Hotzi alav ksav yada. Everybody have the text, or if you need help locating it in the sheet.
Ayin vav amud aleph.
Kuf ayin vav amud aleph in Bava Basra.
Not the Rashbam.
We're going to talk about the Rashbam in just a minute. It's also on the Mar Makomos.
I know. So is it before that?
Well, yes,
I see it. I'm sorry.
It's the piece right before.
Yeah.
What page is that? Is that page 8?
I don't see page numbers on my thing.
Oh, okay.
For some reason,
you know what? It could be I didn't put the numbers there, and you just have to count them. But either way, Hotzi alav ksav yado shu chayiv lo. That's the Mishnah. Govim min chasim b'nei chorin. You can collect from assets that are accessible, but not from lien property. Says the Gemara, Boy minei Rabba bar Nasan mi Rabbi Yochanan. So Rabba bar Nasan asked the following question. Let's say you want to strengthen this autograph, this, ksav yad. So how do you do that? We take it to court, because, there's always, remember, who I think Dr. Weg, right? Before mentioned about challenging, right?
Yes.
Okay, so good. I told you we'd get some challenges. So let's say somebody comes to court and he says, I don't believe that's you. I don't believe that's not my signature. It's not my handwriting. Right? So we have in the halacha, whenever we're dealing with documents, we also deal with authentication. It's called, kiyum, or kiyum ksav yado. So the Gemara says, let's say, let's say I want to strengthen my document. Oh, excellent, very good. If the page that there is now, oh, exactly. You see, it says Talmud Babli Masechet Kuf Ayin Vav. No, that's exactly it. Not the Rashbam.
Got to go up a little.
Go up a little. Go back a little bit more. The previous entry. Perfect. Perfect. Yeah. Right over here. Hotziel Ksav Yad Shu Chayev Lo. Perfect. Govim and Chasim b'nei Chorin. Says the Gemara, what if Huksak Ksav Yad bebezdin mai? Let's say go to court and you verify or authenticate that it's really the signature of the debtor. Maybe that would be good enough even to be Govim and Chasim b'shubadim. Sorry, even though you've strengthened the autograph, you still can't collect from Menchasim Mishubadim. So listen to this. This is a classic. This is one of the most famous Gemaras ever. Massive Rami Barcham. Shlosha Gittim Psulim. What's he quoting? Our Mishnah that we started with. Why do you think he's quoting it? You would have thought because of Ksav Yad, because that's the other Mishnah about Ksav Yad. There are two Mishnayos about Ksav Yad, one in Gittin, one in Bava Basra. But actually, the reason he's quoting it is because of the end of the Mishnah, because of Eidei Mesira. So he says the following. The Mishnah says, Shlocha Gittim Psulim, Vimnise Savlad Kosher, Elohein, Kosa B'Ksav Yado, Ve'enol. I'm going quickly because we read this Mishnah before. Kosa B'Ksav Yado, Ve'enol Avedim. He writes in his own handwriting without witnesses. Yeshal of Edim, there are Edim, Ve'ein Bozman, no timing. Yesh Bozman, Ve'ein Bo Elayacha, Gittim Psulim. Vimnise Savlad Kosher. Then the Mishnah concludes, Rabbi Lazar Omer, Apal Pisha Ein Olavedim Elishanasno Bifneidim Kosher, the Govim and Chasim Mishubadim. So what does the Mishnah say? That even if there are only Eidei Mesira, are Eidei Mesira signed on the document? No. They're merely present when the document is handed over. And nonetheless, what do we say? That your Govim and Chasim Mishubadim. So what is the Gemara asking? The Gemara is quoting the Mishnah that we began with in Gittin and saying, you see from Eidei Mesira that you can be Govim and Chasim Mishubadim even without Eidei Chasima, even if there are no signatures, right, on this contract. So is Ksav Yad worse than Eidei Mesira, than a Shtar Eidei Mesira?
Well, it depends on what your outlook is on Kol.
And on Shtar Eidei Mesira.
I'm having a problem with is what greater Kol is there than if it goes before Bezdin to authenticate.
Right, so I'm saying it's not only Kol. Kol is true, and Kol, it also requires that there be a certain stature in the contract. So it's a little bit of one and a little bit of the other, depending on which Mefarsha we're talking about. But what's fascinating here is the Gemara is basically saying, if you authenticate the Ksav Yad, why should it be worse than Shtar B'Eidei Mesira? But the answer is Shtar B'Eidei Mesira is still a Shtar. So what the Gemara is basically saying is Ksav Yad's a Shtar. It just doesn't have signatures. Either does Eidei Mesira. If you don't want to compare Ksav Yad and Eidei Chasima, that's fine. But whatever works for Eidei Mesira, not Eidei Chasima, meaning the presence of witnesses, maybe that should be good enough for Ksav Yad. So what the Gemara is doing is weighing this question that we're interested in. What is the status of a autograph, a self, styled contract?
Is there any relevance to the machlokas of Meir and?
Yes, this is what it's saying. What it's saying is, if you're talking about Rabbi Meir,
the value of the Eidei Mesira, according to one, it's at least equivalent to Eidei Chasima. In which case,
no, it's almost like the Gemara. It's like the Gemara is saying, listen, if the Milva B'Shtar, which is Govim and Chasim Shabadim, would be limited to Eidei Chasima, to Rabbi Meir, then we understand the difference between that and Ksav Yado. But once you're saying that there's Geviyim and Chasim Shabadim, even for Rabbi Eliezer, even for Eidei Mesira, even though they're not written in the Shtar, that looks an awful lot closer to Ksav Yado. Now, what's the answer of the Gemara? The Gemara says, Shaini Hasam de Mishas Ksiva hu deshabe nafshe. Very ambiguous answer, and there's a different girsa, as we'll see in a moment. There's a lot of debate about what this line actually means. So if we look at the Rashbam, which is also on the page here and on the screen as well, I see. Rashbam Masechet Bava Basra Kufayin Vav Ben Aleph. You don't need to scroll yet because it's right there. Rashbam says, Hachi Garsinan, because there were two different variants of the text. Shiny Hasam de Bishas Ksiva Udishibe Navshe. There's another girsa which says, and Tosas has it on Daf Gimel on the base, Shiny Hasam de Bishas Ksuva. No, don't move. Leave things as they are. Yeah, actually, that's good. Having it exactly where it is now is perfect for the moment. Who's doing the moving? Is it Sheila?
I assume so.
Okay. No, it's
a very good job.
Rachel Oppenheim
is doing it.
Yeah.
Oh, thank you so much. How does one do this? So you have to.
Sorry, what am I doing? Am I doing the right thing or the wrong thing?
No, perfect.
Thank you for doing it.
Oh, okay.
It's called
Thank you.
Are you a co-host? Is that it?
No, not as I know.
Oh. Anybody can screen share, basically.
Oh, wow. Okay, terrific. Thank you so much.
Thank you for doing it.
Your husband used to provide us with the Gemaras. So you're continuing that, special
legacy.
100%. And we still miss him all the time. Anyways, so the what the Rashbam is trying to explain, there's one girsa that says Mishas Ksuva, meaning Shtar Beit Masira wouldn't be Govim in Chasim Mishuvadim. You couldn't get liened property from a document which doesn't have signed witnesses but only has witnesses present. But in the case of a get, there's also a ksuva, and that is signed. That's one girsa, but the Rashbam goes further. The Rashbam says no. It's mishas ksiva d'shei b'nafshe. Kisha nichtav ashtar, nichtav kedei lamasro b'fnei edim. When the shtar is written, it's written with the goal of being presented in the presence of witnesses. Sheyu edim asir b'makom edei chasima. Even though they're not signed on the document, it's as if they were. If you remember, the Ran in Hamagare said, edei chasim are like virtual edei masira. The Rashbam in Bava Basra is saying the opposite. He's saying Eidei Masira are like virtual Eidei Chasima, meaning when you prepare this document and you don't sign people in there, but your intention is that it be delivered in the presence of two witnesses, it's as if the two witnesses are always connected to this document. And therefore, it's like this is a shtar with Eidim. Hilkach. Even to Rabbi Lazar, Ede Mesira Karsi. Therefore, since according to Rabbi Lazar, Ede Mesira's Karsi, Ki'ilu Nichtemu Betoch Hashtar Dami. Aval Anu Mi Boile, and the Gemara were asking, Bahotik Savyado. 1 second, just let me. Bahotik Savyado Bi Alma, Sheshmo Shalova Chasumbo, Shezeh Masalo B'Makom Hoda, Shalo Yuchal Achsar V'Lichbar Bo. Lomar Paraiti, Holzman Shechasimaso Biad Malve. The Gemara, he says, is asking about something else. They want to know about a Ksav, where there's no Edom whatsoever, just the autograph of the individual. But since he writes, that he incurred this debt, and now look what the Rashbam put in. Shelo yuchal lachzor v'lichbar v'lomar paraiti. Holzman shechasimaso biad malve. What does he tell us? The din of shtarcha biadi my boy, says the Rashbam, he just slips it in, applies to a ksavyad. So what the Rashbam says is a ksavyad, of the two characteristics of a contract, right, that differentiates it from a loan in the presence of witnesses, al peh. When it comes to those two elements, the Rashbam says, even though the Gemara's conclusion is that there is no gviyim and chasim shibadim for a ksavyad, but the property of shtarcha b'yadi my boy, namely, you can't say I repaid you if I've left the smoking gun in your hand. The smoking gun will apply not only to a shtar with edim, but to a ksavyad as well. And if you look at the next Rashbam, which is also on the page, so we still don't need to move anything yet. The Rashbam earlier in the Masechta, Daf Mem Amud Aleph, says it even more explicitly. There the Gemara says, Hoda b'fnei shnayim. Let's say a person acknowledges in the presence of two witnesses that he owes money. Yeah, perfect. Adam shemoda lechavero bifnei shnayim. A person in the presence of two witnesses admits that he owes money. Shechayev lo mana. Tzarich lomar ksuvu sheyitzavim alo v'lichtav lo shtar l'malva le'edus. You can't automatically, if somebody says, in the presence of two witnesses, I owe this other fellow $100, the witnesses cannot take it upon themselves to create a contract unless they get explicit permission from the debtor. Why? The kol shah sheyirtza ligvos chovo yotzi shtaro ala lova. Avol shelo b'rshus lova ein kosvin. The chovu lo. The kivin ala lova lichto v'hu lo tziva ikelamemer lo nichol elasos cho shechayiv milva b'shtar ad hashta hava milva al peh. The afal gav the hoda b'fnei edim neman hu lomar kol shah sheyirtza paraiti. So basically, the Rashbam is explaining that even if somebody admits, or there's a loan that takes place in the presence of two witnesses, or somebody admits in the presence of two witnesses that he owes, $100, the Edom cannot take it upon themselves to write a shtar, because if they do, then there are two significant consequences that the loveh, the debtor, may prefer not to incur. One is gviyah min chasim mishubadim. The property, the lien property, becomes also a source for collection. And two is he can no longer claim that he repaid because of shtar chabiyadi, my boy, because of the smoking gun of the contract. So, and even though he admitted, nonetheless, hamalvus chaver be'edim ain't tzarich lefaro be'edim. If it's only in the presence of witnesses, he's not obligated to repay with witnesses. But if somebody had written a contract, then you would say, why didn't you rip up the evidence or provide me with a receipt? And therefore, you can't write a contract without the permission of the lover. But then he adds in the end, even if it isn't a shtar, all it is an autograph, meaning the lover writes a text without witnesses saying, I owe money to the malveh. Even then, he can only collect from the chasim b'nei chorin, but eino neman lomar paraiti. But he's not believed to claim I paid back, because Ksav Yad also is an outstanding piece of evidence, a smoking gun that he left in his rishus.
So would the Rashbam say the same thing about a shtar signed by only one witness?
That's a great question. I'm going to talk about that later. The Rambam's view on that is that it's a case of what we call Naskad Rababa. This is the Rambam in Perek Daled, Hilchos Toin V'Nitan Halacha Ches. But that's a great in-between case that we're going to just, hold me to it to get back to it. I don't know if I'll get to it today. But
Rabbi, if I understand correctly, there has to be symmetry. If it's a written document to begin with, then the end of the document, if there's a devolution
repayment
of the fund, there has to be something in writing, either tearing up of the document.
Right.
If there's witnesses only, then there must be witnesses to the refund of the money.
No. That's the only thing that's not true. If there was witnesses to the incurring of the obligation, you do not have to provide witnesses for the repayment. But if there's a text, then either you need to have, and you claim that you repaid, then you either need a shovar, which is a receipt, or you need to have, torn up the outstanding stuff. Okay. What is the Rashbam's view on Ksav Yad?
Witnesses.
Right. So the Ksav Yad for the Rashbam in both places is treated half like a shtar and half not like a shtar. Not like a shtar in Shibudim, but yes, like a shtar for shtar Kobiyadi my boy. And that's also the view of Tosas. If you look in the next Mar Malkom, Tosas also, but Tosas' language is actually a little different. But Tosas here reveals that the Rif disagrees. Perfect. If you have Tosas Ksuvos Chaf Aleph Amud Aleph, Thank you for scrolling up a little. Hotziel of Ksavyoda Shuchayv Logova Menachasim B'nei Chorin. Pasuk Rav Alphus. Rav Alphus is the Rif, who was from Fez. That Dafka Kishaomer Lahayu Devarim Me'olam. If the guy says, I never met you, I never borrowed money from you, and the other guy can produce a Ksavyad, then we know he's a liar. Because you can't say, I never borrowed from you, when in your own handwriting you admit that you borrowed. However, but if he says, I paid you back, says the Rif, and all you have is not a star, but a ksavyad, he disagrees with the Rajbam. The Rif says, the principle of shtarcha b'yadi my boy, which is, how could you leave a smoking gun? How could you not collect a shovar? How could you leave, damaging evidence in my hands? Obviously, you didn't pay.
What isn't the
true about a shtar be'edim? It's not true about a ksavyad. It doesn't explain why yet.
Isn't the fundamental issue? Maybe that's what they're trying to say here. If you hold that a shtar, a person's own handwriting, is not equivalent to a shtar, then you can understand why he didn't ask for it back. He didn't feel it had any
even better. I'll go you one further. 100%. So the Ramban in Milchamos goes even a little bit of a step further. The Ramban, but I'm going to try to show that the Rambam disagrees on this idea, and that the Rambam thinks this is a much more fundamental idea. The Ramban says he's troubled. The Balamor in the end of Bava Basra says what Tosas says and what Tosas Rid says. We'll see in a second. He says, I don't understand. Well, why doesn't the smoking gun idea work? So the Ramban says something quite brilliant. He says, listen, there's no Gviyim and Chasim Mishabadim, right? That's already half the value of a shtar. So he says, it's not such a smoking gun. Meaning, if the smoking gun also included an expansion of the ability to collect the assets, meaning even assets that are not available but are liened property, that would be a smoking gun. There, no one would leave it.
So it's a disagreement as to the mindset.
That's according to the Ramban. But I show for the Rambam, I don't believe that's true.
If the Lover doesn't believe that the document that he wrote has any real standing, then he's not going to get all worked up about getting it back.
Right.
He did believe that.
That's the Ramban. But if you look at Tosfos, now look at the
because Tosfos, I guess, must believe that the guy believes that it has standing.
Yeah.
It has value. So if that
it does have value.
Then you would have asked for it back.
Everybody agrees it has value. The question is how much value, and what I'm going to try to show is I think in the Rambam it's not that way. But let me finish Tosfos first because there's something else in Tosfos. Tosfos says, quotes the Rif. I'm explaining the Rif according to the Ramban. I'm going to explain the Rif according to the Rambam in a minute. But the Tosfos says, I disagree. Ein nir l'Rabbeinu Yitzchak. Ki minayin lo zeh hachiluk. Says, I don't get the distinction. Either way, a smoking gun is a smoking gun. Ki savar de bekol shtar ein a rogel lefroa ad sheyaser lo shtaro. Notice the language. Pay close attention to the language of Tosfos as opposed to the Rajbam. The Rajbam said the same shita, but a different formulation. The Rajbam said, even though Iksavyad is not a shtar, it's still a smoking gun. The Tosfos says, I don't understand what the difference is. Iksavyad is a shtar. Right? Let me one more time. Einir l'ri. The Rif will say, yeah, but this isn't a shtar, this is a ksavyad. Even the Rajbam said, even though a ksavyad is not a shtar, it's still a smoking gun. Shtar, so ksavyadcha biyadi, my boy. So what's going on here? Even within the view of Rajbam, Balamor, Tosfos, we'll see, Tosfos Rid, Rush, even within that view, there seems to be a debate whether or not, even if you say shtarcha b'yadi my boy equivalent applies to ksavyad, there's still a debate whether or not it's considered a shtar, or even though it's not a shtar, you still have it. Now, what I want to show is the opposite is true as well. So the Rif says, we don't say the equivalent of shtarcha b'yadi my boy, but why? So I told you a minute ago, the Ramban says why? Because since there's no shibud, it's not such a big deal. But look at the Rambam now. Now I want you to look at the Rambam. if we could, you know what? Before we get to Ram, I want to read the Tosas Rid.
Thank you.
A couple of minutes. The Tosas Rid is on the page, exactly perfect. Hodah b'fnei shtayim ve'ein tzarich lomar ksova. Kasav heina Rabbeinu Shmuel Zatzokol. The Tosas Rid is quoting the Rashbam. Afilu hotzi amalve lilove. Right, even if the malva produces a ksav yado, shu chayiv lo gova min chasim b'nei chorim ve'einu neman lomar paraiti. That's the that's the position of the Rashbam. Says the Tosas Rid, B'niran li devarav, I think he's right. Aval Rabbi Yitzchak mifez, but the Rif Zatzokol, right? Zecher Tzadik v'Kadosh Levracha, Kosa b'Shili Masech, and he wrote at the end of Bav Basra, the Kivan de Kimilva al Pedami is already a different language. It's like Milva al Peh Ksavyad. Itoin v'ama paraiti ne'aman. He will be believed. It's not considered a smoking gun because a ksavyad is not a star, it's a milva al peh. Let's keep going. 1 second. The Tosas Rid says, Ve'eno nirali. I don't think it's true. Nei de logavi mi mishabdi, even though it's true that it's not a star with respect to liened property, mishum de leislei kala, that's your, preferred explanation. There's no publicity. Avolo shani mishtara ma'alya, it's still a full star, it just doesn't have a call. Why? The chasima, this is you're the Tosas Rid, this is what you said earlier, both things. The chasimas yado kemea edem dami. The chiheche de b'shtar de ikasadi lo mehem and lo mer paraiti hachanami b'ksav yado. What is the Tosas Rid saying? It's not just a smoking gun, that's a ksav yad. The ksav yad is the equivalent of a star, because the ksav yad is the equivalent of hodos baldin kemea edim dami.
But it still doesn't have a call.
Right, no, that's why there's no shibudim, but we're not arguing about shibudim. We're arguing about shtar chaviyali my boy.
But all of this basically is the semantics on two sides of saying we have an imperfect document. So now the question is it more animal or mineral? Is it more...
Right, but it's not semantics.
Star or is it less?
This goes to the fundamental question, do you need witnesses, objective witnesses, for something to be considered a contract? Or is this just a glorified Hodas Baldin, but it's lacking any Reish Lakish type aspect of Eidos Shabishtar?
But what happens, you can take any side of the argument, and that's what's happening here.
You can't take any side of the argument because you're also trying to prove it from other contexts.
No, but since it has...
it's an in-between.
It has values of a star, and it doesn't have values of a star.
Right, that's what's so fascinating.
Depends how you look at it. It's almost, which side you take to look at it. So it's a never-ending argument. Because
instead of the argument being about the properties and which property dictates what, the real issue is, given that it has some properties in one direction and some in another, what is it that makes a contract as opposed to something which is merely a written Hodas Baldin? So look at the Rambam, because my time is running out.
The different parts of the document, they're not all pointing to the same part and saying, oh, because it has that part, it should or shouldn't. One is pointing to the,
right, but what I'm trying to show is that even the group that says that even though there's no shibudim, there still is shtar chabiyadi my boy, even then we can detect the Rashbam is saying, even though it's not a star, Tosas and the Tosas Rid are saying, because it's a star. Even though there's no shibudim, it's a star.
Is there any fundamental...
Rashbam is saying there's no shibudim, it's not a star, but there's still a smoking gun. Now, on the other side, in the Rif world, the Rif says, no, there's no shtar chabiyadi my boy here. There's no shibudim, and we also, if you want to claim you paid, we'll believe you. So the Ramban says, not because it isn't a shtar, but because since there's no shibudim, it's not such a smoking gun. Now look at the Rambam.
Is it a coincidence, or is there a Masorah aspect that the Sfaradim and the Ashkenazim are on opposite ends completely in every step of the way, without exception?
It's not unusual for the authority figures of electric schools to be very dominant. There are always exceptions anyway. But because people have their own mind, they're independent thinkers.
The Rif is basically, the Rambam follows the Rif in most cases.
The Rambam, background is the Rif for sure, and Rabbi Chananel and the Gaonim. But the Rambam is such an independent thinker that he always, reformulates, like we show with the Rimigash also. So here's also a great example of it. Look what the Rambam did. The Rambam made everything about the conceptual question, is this a milva al peh or a milva bishtar? He eliminates any of the umdana parts, like would he do this? How come he didn't get a receipt? To him, it's all about the question of the status. And with this, I'm going to conclude for today. But let's look at these Rambams in Parak Yud Aleph, Hilchos Malva V'Lova, Halacha Aleph, Beis, and Gimel. The Rambam starts off by saying, Amalvas Chaver B'Fnei Eidim, if you take out a loan in the presence of witnesses, not a contract, O she'amar le'edim heyo alai edim shani chayv zeh mana o atamedai shani chayv lezeh mana zu nikras milva al peh. All this is called, you can already see what's going on in the Rambam. The Rambam is a legal thinker. He's formulating everything as if the real issue is the categorization. The classification, is it a milva al peh or a milva bishtar? He says it's a milva al peh. The ein tzarich lefaro be'edim. Therefore, you don't need to repay it in the presence of edim. Therefore, if he claims after it was due that he already paid it up, that's kofar hakol, and we believe him. That's not controversial, except that the Rambam is making it all about milva al peh. About milva's chaver b'shtar, but if he borrows with a contract, tzarich lefaro be'edim, then he better pay back in the presence of witnesses. O Haved, and bring witnesses, O Amed v'shalem lechovo. Because after all, right, this is the principle of shtarcha biyadi, my boy. Okay, now, I'm going to skip the rest of this because this is not so relevant. Look at halacha base. Lava shekosav shtar b'ksav yado. If the lova writes an autograph, right, he writes, but he also signs on Eidim, the Heid Bo Eidim, B'Nosan L'Malva, Harez Shtar Kosher. That's a regular shtar. Just because he wrote it, as long as he appended witnesses, that's a regular shtar. V'chein, Im Kosa B'Shtar, Afa B'Shem Bo Eidim, B'Nosan L'Malva B'Fnei Eidim, Harez Milva B'Shtar. That's Eidei Chasima and Eidei Mesira. Now look at Halacha Gimel. Otzi Alav Ksav Yado. Let's say he only has a Ksav Yad without Eidim. And there are no witnesses at all, not Mesira, not Kasima. This is the Rambam's psak of the Gemara on Kufayin Vav, even though he had his signature authenticated. So we know it's an accurate document. And now he's trying to explain these halachos. Hareza Kamilva al peh lechol davar. Those words don't appear before the Rambam. This is even though there's a text, since there are no edim, it has a legal status of milva al peh l'chol davar. What does that mean? Bimton shapara. If the guy now claims that he paid, it's beniftar. It's kofar hakol. There's no shtar chabiyad my boy because it's not a shtar. It's a milva al peh. The Eina Gova B'Ksav Zeh, Lo Min HaYarshav, Lo Min HaLukud, there's no Shibudim. Now, if the Ramban's interpretation of the Rif was right, which is that the reason there's no Shtar Chabiyani my boy is because there's no Shibudim, and therefore it's not such a big deal, the Rambam would have had to flip the order. In the Mishnah, we only know one thing, and that is that a Ksav Yad doesn't have Nechasa Mishubadim. The Ramban says, you know why? You know why there's no Shtar Chabiyani my boy? You know why it's not a smoking gun? Because there's no Nechasa Mishubadim. But the Rambam, the way he writes it, number one, everything depends on milva al peh, milva b'shtar. Number two, it's milva al peh l'chol davar. And number three, the first thing he tells us about it is the thing that the Mishnah doesn't tell us, and that's the controversy. Normally, if you're writing law, you want to write. You start off on a sure bet. Like first, you write the law that's explicit. Then you write the law that is maybe your conclusion, but has, is less based on evidence, right? This is a massive debate in half the halachic world. I mean, all of the Chachmei Tzorfat and Ashkenaz, half of the Chachmei Provence, disagree with this psak of the Rambam. No one disagrees about Mishubadim, that's a Mishnah. By flipping the order, the Rambam was Ke'ilu saying, I don't mean this, I'm saying this anachronistically. The Ramban is is quite a long time after the Rambam. He's saying the mentality that the Ramban, in 150 years is going to express, which is that the reason why there's no Shtar Chabyani My Boy in a Ksav Yad is because there's no Nechasim Mishabad, and that's wrong. The reason that there is no Shibudim is actually the same reason that there's no Shtar Chabyani My Boy. And that is because this is a Milva Al Peh. It doesn't have the status of a Milva Bishtar. So the Rambam, within the worldview of the Rif, unlike the Ramban, what emerges here.
Because it's a Milva Al Peh, the borrower had no reason to even want the Shtar back because it had no value.
Or it also may be the idea. This is where I don't want to get, it's a little bit late, so I'm just going to say this very quickly. You asked me earlier, what about a shtar be'ed echad? Do we say shtar chabyani my boy? Correct?
Right.
So as it happens, that is a very controversial case. And that's a case where the Rambam shines. The Rambam in Perek Daled of Hilchos Toin V'Nitan Halacha Ches says in that case, we apply the principle, we discussed something last year, Nasked Rababa. What is Nasked Rababa? Nasked Rababa is a case, the following case. A grabs a watch from B in the presence of one witness, right? And, he says, he says, look, you saw what he did. He grabbed my watch. And the guy says, in Chatfi, I did grab your watch, but I did grab the watch, sorry, but it's my watch. I was just taking back the watch that you took from me. So the Gemara says, what are you going to do in this case? There's an Eid Echad, there's a single witness. If there were two witnesses, we'd say he's guilty because he took a piece of, a property that was in the hands of the other fellow. And we have a principle, Chazaka kol ma shetachas yad adam areu shelo. If something's in my property, the presumption is that it's mine. So the two witnesses would force him to return it. But there's only one witness. So what's he going to do? Swear? He can't swear because, according to the Rambam, you can only swear. You can only swear if you're going to deny the Eid Echad. You're going to say you're a liar, which you said is false. He doesn't think it's false. He says, you're right. You saw what you saw, just so you don't know the context. In chatfi v'didi chatfi. So the Rambam says, meaning he can't swear, so he's got to pay. He's got to give it back. So this is the question the Achronim ask. They say, it doesn't make any sense because that's in the case of Nasked Rababa. But the case here is what? You have an Eid Echad and a shtar, and you said, yeah, it's true, I borrowed the money, but I paid it back. So the Rambam says, so the question is, what do you mean? Is it a smoking gun or is it not a smoking gun? If it's a smoking gun, even though there's only an Eid Echad in it, then you don't need mitok shein echad l'shav mishalim. Just say, shtar chabyani my boy. If it's not a smoking gun because it's only one Eid Echad in it, not two Eidim, and therefore, I'm going to be a little more careless, more risk averse. I'm not going to demand a shovar, a receipt, or rip up the original document. Then he shouldn't be able to take a shvuah either. He should be able to say kol for hakol. How do you get the middle that he's really obligated to take a shvuah, but he can't, and therefore he has to pay? So Reb Chaim explained, you see from here that the principle of shtar chabyani my boy isn't just an umdana. It's just not. It's not only there's damaging, evidence that contradicts your claim. The shtar, the Edom shebeshtar contradict your claim. If what you're saying about this case is reasonable, that's the chiddush of Reish Lakish of Edom achasum malashtar nasa commission echra dusim bebesin. That's the idea of a blank check of testimony. If there's only one aid, then you have to swear. This is totally consistent with the Rambam that we're reading here in Perek Yud Aleph, Hilchos Malva Velova. Because what's the Rambam saying? Shtar chabyani my boy doesn't depend on the umdana alone. It really depends on whether we consider this to be milva al peh or a milva b'shtar. It's a special din in shtaros that we say shtar chabiyani my boy, because the edus shebishtar. But ksav, says the Rambam, it doesn't have edus. It may be your personal hodas baldin, but it's not edus. So just to sum up, and we're going to stop here, but we have to finish up with this next week, because we didn't get back to Kiddushin yet and to Gerushin. Just to sum up what we did, we're talking about a middle case. There's something in the halacha called the milva al peh, or a transaction al peh, and there's something called a shtar, a contract. A ksav yad seems to be, phenomenologically in between. It's a text, it's something written, right? But it's not, supported by the authority of witnesses. So what is that? Is that like an oral obligation, or is that like a contractual obligation? Somewhere in between. So what we've seen is, with regard to Gittin, Minatorah, you could be Megaresh with a Ksav Yad. Minatorah, I'm not talking about Midrabana. With regard to Dine Maminis, the Mishnah says there's no Gviyah Menachasa Mishabadim, but it's hard to evaluate that. Is that for technical reasons of call, or is that because it isn't really a shtar? Then you have a massive debate, that split the halachic world, right? The Chachmei, Bali Tosfos, and the Rashbam, and so on and so, the Balamor, they all say, well, it's true there's no Nechasa Mishabadim, but there is the equivalent of Shtar Chabyari Maibai in a Ksav Yad. It has some characteristics of a shtar. But is that because it's like a shtar, or is that because it's a smoking gun and it's just an extraneous, proof? What we found was Rashbam, Tosfos, Tosas Rid, they all say it a little bit differently. On the other hand, in the world of the Rif and the Rambam and the Ramban, they say Ksav Yad, not only is there no Mishubadim, but there's also no Shtar Chabyani Maibai. But some of them say, because like the Ramban says, there's no shibudim, it's not such a big risk. There's not such an umdina. But the way the Rambam understands it, by flipping the order and by formulating it, the Rambam says it's a milva al peh. But if it's a milva al peh, so then how come it works in Gittin? And does it work in Kiddushin? On the one hand, there's a hekesh that connects Gittin and Kiddushin. On the other hand, maybe the chiddush of Kasa B'Ksav Yado is limited to Gittin itself. So we're going to see next week that is the view of the Rajba in Yevamos and in Kiddushin. The Rajba says Ksav Yado does not work in Kiddushin. The Ritva disagrees. And I want to show you Shitas Rambam because I think it's interesting. Okay? So we'll finish with this topic in Mir Hashem next week. We'll move
Thank
on.
you so much, Rabbi Shkoch.
Have a great week, everybody.
Ritva disagrees with his Rebbe?
Say that again?
The Ritva disagrees with the Rashba?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, as we've shown many times, especially when there's a Ra'ah and a Rashba, the Ritva usually sides with the Ra'ah. But now all the Rishonim were independent. They didn't always go...
Yeah, I don't understand why we always ask that question. I mean, you can have...
There's an influence, a very big influence of a Rebbe to a Talmud. There's no question about that.
But you're independent.
The expectation is that when people think... What's that?
Certain mindsets, thought process.
There's a thought process and so on. I mean, it's a very powerful thing. But at the same time, people are
be independent.
Creative and independent. And that's why it's always dialectical. There's always, both of these things are true. There's influence and there are always exceptions and independence. Okay. Have a great week, everybody. And
thank you.
Thank you very much for doing the scrolling of the.
It was lo b'chavana, but I'm glad it worked.
It was very good.
Thank you.
Okay, so have a good week, everybody.